Welcome, everyone. This is Dr. Balkan Devlen. I am a senior fellow and the director of the Transatlantic program at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and welcome to Inside Policy Talks. Today, I'm with two of the greatest experts on Indo-Pacific and China in Canada to talk about the foreign interference inquiry that was finally announced last week. I'm joined by Jonathan Berkshire Miller, Director of the Foreign Affairs, National Security, and National Defense here at MLI, and Dr. Charles Burton, one of the leading experts on China and the Chinese Communist Party here in Canada, and a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
Well, this has been, long coming. The whole debate about whether we should have an inquiry regarding the foreign interference that due to the revelations that the press had over the past year about how the Chinese Communist Party tried to subvert Canadian democracy and Canadian institutions. The government initially appointed a special rapporteur, which was largely a flop in terms of convincing the Canadians broadly that this has been taken seriously. And finally, the government seemed to sort of give in to setting up a public inquiry to look at foreign interference in Canadian democracy. But is this good enough? This is what we want to talk about today. So let me start with you, Charles. Since you have been at the forefront of Chinese interference and intimidation when it comes to highlighting the dangers from the CCP subversion here in Canada, way before all these leaks came out, and way before the Canadian public broadly was aware of that. Could you provide us a little bit an overview of what you see as sort of the terms of the inquiry and how it looks like and what it's supposed to address? And then we'll take it from there.
Well, the inquiry is entitled Public Inquiry into Foreign Interference and Federal Electoral Processes and Democratic Institutions. And the government has not limited it to China, although, the documents that have been released through the Globe and Mail and Global News were all related to Chinese state and regime-associated foreign interference. So I think primarily the materials that we're looking at are about China. I think over the years that I've been writing about this, most of my information was based on circumstantial evidence and also comparing comparable Chinese government regime-associated activities in other countries, particularly Australia and New Zealand, that had some quite strong revelations about the malign nature of a large proportion of the diplomatic cohort of the People's Republic of China in their country. What we have now is the release of these intelligence assessments from the Canadian Security Intelligence Service and from the Intelligence Assessment Secretariat of the Privy Council Office that are based on wiretaps and surreptitious monitoring of communications between Chinese diplomats themselves and between Chinese diplomats and other actors. So, the issue has suddenly taken on a much more life than it might have had, in my literally a couple of hundred op-eds, of which, a good proportion have mentioned the influence aspect. I think the bottom line here is, the issues that we are concerned about are Chinese diplomats who are not performing normal diplomatic functions. Due to one of the agents of the Chinese Ministry of State Security being outed in one of the documents, Zhao Wei, this gentleman was declared persona non grata and returned to China. But what about the others? In the course of evidence to parliamentary committee, there was a suggestion that 70% of China's very large cohort of 176 diplomats is engaged in these influence and intimidation operations on behalf of the Ministry of State Security and the Chinese Communist Party's United Front Work Department. So would we see after this report more diplomats expelled? Then there's the other question of state harassment of diasporas. That's mentioned as part of the mandate in I think clause C3. Quite significant. Can we actually protect people in Canada from harassment and intimidation activities of a foreign state beyond what we've done so far, which is with regard to the family of parliamentarian? And then we want to see, can we get a foreign influence transparency registry so that people who have been perhaps greedy and naive enough to receive benefits from the Chinese state can be forced to declare that publicly, so that we would perceive if people in the policy process might have a conflict of interest. So, there are a number of issues which are sort of floating out around there. And the inquiry has already been restricted by the last clause in the Privy Council's term of reference, which says that Justice Ogue will only have access to cabinet documents that were already provided to the independent special rapporteur, David Johnston. So there seems to be already, right in the terms of reference, a suggestion that she will not be receiving everything that she might want to see. And I think there's also the question of how much money and how many resources will be devoted to an exercise, the first phase of which is supposed to terminate in February. Will she have a large staff of qualified lawyers who will have this kind of pitbull interrogation of people in the government elite who may have reason to not be forthcoming about why they suppressed information with regard to Chinese interference and influence activities, or if they did have a conflict of interest? We really need to get to the bottom of this and get it cleared up before the next election. And so far, I don't think we have enough information to be able to determine whether that result is likely to occur.
Excellent. Judge, I'll turn in a minute, but to me, as Charles pointed out, two things sort of stand out. One, this is almost textbook, yes, minister, yes, prime minister, Sir Humphrey style of public inquiry, as the famous British political satire show suggests. One of the first rules of government is don't look into things that you don't have to, and the second is never start an inquiry if you don't know the outcome. And the last clause right there that you pointed out suggests to me that the government is really very, very closely watching that particular show. The second is that it seems to be sort of a kitchen sink model of throwing everything that has to do with foreign interference. And I'm not particularly sure, and this is where I'm going to turn to Jonathan in a minute, I'm not sure this is a particularly good way of doing it, because all those issues, I think, important and distinct in a way that needs to be dealt with. There is the issue of election interference in the elections in 2019 and in 2021 by the agents of Chinese Communist Party, and who knows what when within the machinery of government about those allegations. So there is one sort of a line of inquiry that needs to be done about the responsibility of that. Another one, as you pointed out, is the targeting and intimidation of the diaspora communities. It goes beyond just the Chinese interference, but Russia, Iran, and others playing a big role in targeting that. And our friends in Alliance Hong Kong, Canada, for example, have been receiving end of it. You have been at the receiving end of it. Our friend and colleague Marcus Kolga have been at the receiving end of the Russian intimidation and harassment. So that is another line of inquiry. And then the third one that is about what is within the system, the Canadian system, that needs to be corrected to deal with these foreign powers trying to subvert our democratic institutions beyond election interference. So by creating this sort of kitchen sink model, throwing everything in there and limiting the scope quite restrictively, are we going to get where we want to get? So Jonathan, let me turn to you on this and see how you see the sort of both the mandate of the inquiry and these different aspects of it, and how does that perhaps fit in broadly to the need for Canada to think differently when it comes to geopolitics? This is not your grandfather's 1990s anymore, and these foreign actors are very actively trying to subvert our democracy. Where do we stand on that one?
Well, thanks so much. I mean, I would echo many of the comments that Charles already made. But I think fundamentally we have two things going on here. When thinking about the public inquiry, and I think Charles eloquently talked about some of the failures. I mean, frankly, from the beginning, with David Johnson's report and process. When thinking about this new inquiry, I think there's two fundamental different discussions that are going on. Both of them are equally important, but I think trying to get a manageable and impactful sort of result at the end of it, I think, is challenged because of the vague nature. So the two things going on here, first of all, we have the challenge specifically with Chinese interference, and more specifically with regards to the last two federal elections. What the government knew, what the government did not know, trying to get the answers specifically about that, in addition to other challenging issues such as the harassment of parliamentarians and other challenges with our diaspora. Those are issues that I think specifically need to be dealt with, and those are state specific. The second issue, I think, is the more broad dilution of this inquiry on foreign interference. This is not to say that foreign interference is not a problem beyond China, but I think of this fundamentally in three baskets. We have, number one, the intentions of a foreign actor. We have the capabilities of a foreign actor, and then we have the impact of those capabilities and those intentions. So basically, we have other actors. We could talk about Russia, and this institute often does talk about Russia. We can talk about Iran. Both interfere significantly in our democracy. I've heard North Korea being discussed now. I mean, again, North Korea is a bad global actor. Am I worried about North Korea from a foreign interference perspective at the same way that I'm worried about China or Russia or even Iran? No. So what I'm trying to say here is that for us to give this broad basket, I think, will take away from the primary challenges, the primary capability threats, as in addition to those intentional threats that I think China clearly head above heels is the number one challenge for us. The second thing that I'm going to be focused on, so this is the problem with the vague element of this inquiry, but I think we down the road, we also have to think about the impact. So the so what, I guess, question is, we want to hear the answers, and I think Canadians deserve to hear the answers about some of the unresolved questions, in particular on the elections. But I think, and I hope, as an institute that's focused on public policy, that we're actually thinking about how do we remedy some of this. And Charles, of course, has done great work on this and touched on this in his initial comments, whether it's about a foreign influence registry scheme, which I think we've argued, several of our senior fellows have argued for years is necessary. The Australians, obviously, there's imperfections in their act, but basically they have taken those efforts. Our British colleagues have enacted new legislation on this as well. So from a Five Eyes perspective, so our closest allies, we are behind the eight ball on getting very serious about that, and that will have consequences. The second thing is it's not just pieces of legislation, but I think we need the tools within government to start working more seriously on this. With the last cabinet shuffle, the Trudeau government announced a National Security Council, quote unquote. But when you start looking into the details, this is not a National Security Council. Effectively, this is a few members of cabinet meeting and talking about national security, which those sort of functions already exist. So a properly staffed National Security Council with experts, some of those potentially from the outside coming in. I think all of these tools are necessary to deal with a lot of these challenges. Otherwise, we're just going to be having public inquiries every 5 and 6 years because we're not trying to resolve the issues.
No, excellent. Charles, let me turn to you on 2 points. I think you have identified, and Jonathan, sort of re-emphasized when it comes to the public inquiry. On the one hand, as you were also writing this morning in the Globe, this goes beyond, right, the just election interference, and we know that in our allies with with the British recent, sort of revelations that the two people that are working for the China Working Group in the British Parliament and have access to the strongest critiques of China have been arrested, researchers that have been recruited when they were probably students in China. And it would be naive to think that Britain is the only country that China is doing this. So on the one hand, this is very clearly that goes way beyond just the election interference component, the whole intimidation, the secret police stations, etc. And are there enough within the inquiry, within the scope of the inquiry, to be able to deal with this? And the second question is, if you were designing an inquiry to deal with these allegations, or a number of mechanisms, inquiries or commissions and whatever have you, what would you be doing?
Yeah, I think those are great questions. With regard to the first, which is the problem of agents of the Chinese state infiltrating into key positions in Canadian democratic institutions, clearly we aren't doing enough to establish who these people are. I mean, in the Globe and Mail documents, there was allusion to 13 staffers of members of parliament who appeared to be collaborating with the Chinese. Well, I was waiting to hear about how all those people had been at least removed from their positions or possibly brought up before a court of law to be accountable. And, crickets, absolutely nothing. So presumably they're still functioning if, in fact, this is reliable information. So I think when you look at other countries that have these issues, the idea that we can dismiss, as one of our prominent senators has said, is, it may be happening in Australia, but it couldn't possibly be happening here in Canada. It's not something that I can, I'd like us to look into that a bit more closely before we reject the possibility. So, that is a question of resources. How do you engage in proper security assessment of people who spend a lot of time in a country that they disappear into a black box? I mean, myself, after 4 years of education in China, I don't think I'm a sleeper agent for the Chinese, but how would you know? We need to put a lot more resources and expertise into this kind of work. And this really reflects the second question, which is, the challenge that we're facing is so enormous. If there are, say, 120 Chinese diplomats who are involved in this security and influence operations and disinformation tailored to the Canadian market through Chinese language publications, how many people do we need to counter it? Evidence was given in Parliament in the course of the investigations of these documents that suggested that the Chinese Communist Party's United Front Work Department, which oversees these kinds of influence and interference operations, has more resources and personnel than the entire Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And they have about 50,000 people working in Beijing. Well, if our inquiry consists of sending one justice of the Quebec Superior Court with no previous experience in security matters into a secure room and handing her, a pile of several thousand pages of relevant documents, which are then interpreted for her necessarily by people who, in fact, may, not be neutral in this matter, then I don't think we're going to get to the bottom of it. And clearly, to counter a very large Chinese presence in Canada, very well funded, including, as you alluded to, operations off the site of the embassies and consulates in these so-called police stations, or really service centers for Chinese regime activities, not to speak of the Confucius Institutes, which perform a similar function of extension of Chinese influence and espionage operations. How can we possibly expect to get to the bottom of it and determine what sort of legislation and measures we need to address it? And when are we going to get the number of security agents with the requisite Chinese language expertise to be able to counter these matters? I mean, the numbers of our personnel both in, say, the rapid response mechanism of the G7 headquartered in GAC, or in CSIS, or in the RCMP, that have the requisite ability to meet a very well-organized, sophisticated, very well-funded challenge by a foreign state is pretty pathetic. And we won't be able to solve it in 6 months. It's something that requires a fundamental shift in our understanding of what's going on, and taking the appropriate measures to give us the tools to counter a threat to our security and sovereignty and the integrity of our democratic institutions.
To me, it looks like, and I think you put quite eloquently, in the fact that the announcement of policy seems to replace the execution of policy, and this is broadly not only on this particular issue, but in a broad range of other issues, domestic and foreign. When the government feels like when they make an announcement, their job is done. They don't feel like they need to properly resource it, carry it out, execute, and deliver on that. And that, sort of substituting announcement for policy execution is undermining Canadian security and prosperity. And I think this sort of announcing, as you pointed out, something that needs to be very well resourced. Really, we are up against one of the sort of most well-resourced adversaries here, and trying to do this by just fiat, by making an announcement without properly funding this, properly resourcing this, is just going to be, here's an announcement, we did it, but no real policy delivery. But this also undermines our credibility and trust with our partners. And that's what I want to turn to Jonathan here. You pointed out how our Five Eyes allies are dealing with this, and is of course increasing strategic competition between U.S. and China. And our American allies are increasingly vocal about Canada's lack of action, particularly when it comes to China and Chinese interference around. How does failure to deal with this in a serious way would impact our credibility and therefore naturally our interests, and the way we can protect our and promote our interests abroad and with our allies? What will be the impact on this?
Well, it's a great question. I think some of the impact you're already seeing, so from a macro level, of course, I can just point out to one arrangement, which is very much focused on the broader strategic challenge that China poses to its near neighbors, and that's AUKUS. So the arrangement notionally focused on nuclear-powered submarines between Australia, the UK, and the United States, but bigger than that. And the reason I point out to that is you have three members of the Five Eyes, which we mentioned before, who is not involved in that. It's Canada and New Zealand. So that's just one example of it. And I think there's multiple layers of it and counter arguments, but I think that that it is significant that we weren't even thought about in this discussion, which is transcending beyond nuclear-powered submarines. But getting back into the nuts and bolts of intelligence sharing as well, and in the Five Eyes, it's not going to be a simple cut and dry scenario where it's being sliced out of the group. But I think what you've seen over the years and certain incidents and intelligence leaks, et cetera, have had ups and downs in that relationship is the access to information. So there are times where certain types of information is not coming at the clip that it used to, and it's important to remember, while Canada does have some strong capabilities, especially in signals and elsewhere, we are largely a net recipient of intelligence, and when that flow sort of cuts off, I think there's going to be significant challenges. So that's some of the answer to your question, but I want to return quickly to Charles's point, because I think this goes into the discussion about some level of subject matter expertise. And if you think about our allies, for example, the United States, Australia, and the UK as three examples, they're building much more subject matter expertise, in particular on China. So I think of the United States, for example, under their Secretary of Defense. I mean, how many officers there would be specialized on China? Not even the China desk, not even the multiple China desks that they would have. Whereas we still are focused on this very broad scale engagement. And my worry about anything coming out of this inquiry is that the result might be, whether it's at the foreign ministry or whether it's at the Privy Council office, we start to create a task force on foreign interference, and everyone broadly is going to be convening multilateral meetings with colleagues on foreign interference. That's not what we need. Fundamentally, what we're talking about here is a handful, and not even a handful, basically 2 or 3 significant adversaries, 2 which are very consequential, which we need to understand better and we need to action better. So what we're talking about, we're not talking about broadly people who understand foreign interference. That is important, but we need to understand people who understand China more, have those Chinese language skills, as Charles mentioned, and understand the security dimensions of the Chinese state. And Russia would be similar. I think that we've unfortunately not nourished our Russia experts as much as we should. So basically, that's what we're talking about. It's not that difficult. It's not that complicated. We're going back to having and nurturing those subject matter experts and really putting the budgets and resources towards that, which we've neglected for several decades.
I mean, I think this is an excellent point to segue to my last question. But it's important to highlight that when everything matters, when everything is strategic, when everything is key, nothing is. The strategy is matching limited resources with the goals that you want to achieve. And I think in this way, it's very important to get the priorities right and have a very clear-eyed view of which adversaries do matter and how do we need to address that particular threat, rather than basically swarm everything in one big broad number of discussions cross departments, etc., and the end result is a very diluted and very non-specific set of measures that will not be effective. So it is important to get the priorities right, and that of course starts with the issue that we keep coming back in some of our work before. We need to have a proper foreign policy review to set what the Canadian priorities are, what the Canadian national interests are, and how to identify that. My last question to you both is, okay, so predictions are hard, as Yogi Berra said, particularly about the future. But when you look down the road to February, what do you expect to come out of this inquiry?
Well, what I'd like to see is the justice saying, you didn't give me enough time. I haven't been able to assemble a large enough team with security clearance, and I can't deliver the report that you're asking for. I think if she really takes this task with the seriousness that I hope that she will be aggressive and assertive and not allow the government to direct what an independent public inquiry should be about. And so, we haven't heard anything yet very much from Justice Ogue yet, but I'm hoping we'll hear things that will appeal to the Macdonald-Laurier Institute soon.
Excellent. Jonathan?
Well, what I'd like to see, and I mean, predicting what I think will happen versus what I'd like to see, I think is a little bit different. I mean, I predict that unfortunately we'll see a report, whether it's some of the mandate that she's been hampered with, but or whether politics comes into play as well, is we'll see very, very vague headings on certain issues, and much of this will be redacted due to national security. What I think Canadians are owed is some specifics. I understand that they cannot have every detail that's coming out of this inquiry, but I do think that we need some specifics, particularly on the last 2 elections, what happened. And an example of the last inquiry, we did find some specific areas, but they were not necessarily what we expected. For example, David Johnson's point on Handong was very specific, was very clear. Whatever take you have on it. So I would like those same sort of specifics on many of the issues that we're talking about. It's Canadians are owed some specific answers on specific areas, and we very much hope that we get those.
Excellent. This is an issue we'll definitely come back again and again. I believe up to February and beyond, because this really goes to the heart of Canadian democracy and our institutions and our trust in our institutions. As Charles pointed out, this has to be sorted out before the next election, because it has significant impact on how Canadians perceive our election security, and this is beyond what 1 or 2 riding issues. So it is about our trust in the institutions, and that has to be a priority. And Macdonald-Laurier Institute will continue to hold the powers to account and make sure that our byline, making bad public policy unacceptable in Ottawa, continue to shape the way we engage with these issues. So thank you very much to both of you for, I think it was a very interesting discussion, and talk to you on this and other subjects pretty soon.